everybody. Charlie, thank you for making time for me to talk today. And Kath and Christine, I don't know if she's still here, but thank you for the warm welcome here to Australia more broadly. I'm excited to specifically be in this room with you folks, but also just more broadly be at the University of Queensland. So, that's all right. Perfect. All right. Well, it was intimidating coming and talking to a bunch of folks who study identity. So I figured I'd start a little bit with about me. Then I'll talk a little bit about kind of the foundation for a lot of my research, and then the different ways we're trying to apply it. One thing that's really exciting me about the SIGN group is kind of your two branches of kind of your theoretical foundational work, and really some unique ways you've tried to extend that work. So I'm excited to share a little bit of what we're doing back in the cornfields of Illinois around that. All right, so I was born in Chicago. I've always worked with kids. I was one of those people who was still a camp counselor at a developmentally inappropriate time, well into my 20s. And in addition to camp counselor, I've always loved sports. I don't know what the Australian equivalent would be, but I was always one of those kids who would flip the baseball card over to see the stats of the players and stuff like that. And so I got into predictive modeling actually really early on for things like sports and stuff like that. But eventually, some part of me thought I could use this skill set for a more productive purpose. And so I got into child clinical psychology, specifically developmental psychopathology. It allowed me to continue to do some of this predictive modeling stuff while continuing to work with kids. I got my PhD at Rutgers University, which is in the state of New Jersey. I started studying off cognitive vulnerability for kids, actually some self-processes, things like self-competence, things like self-complexity, and how the development of these things during the transition from childhood to adolescence might predict different patterns of distress and impairment. But during that time, I was in a clinical psychology program. I was also working parallel within the child welfare system. I don't know if we use this language down here in Australia, but these are kids who are in contact with government agencies due to experiencing some form of family violence at home. And it was an interesting juxtaposition for me. I was spending my research hours talking about things like rumination and dysfunctional attitudes and stuff like that. And then you'd be working with kids where it seemed like there was much more pressing issues than be talking about these cognitive styles. And so it was an odd time for me. And it led me to pursue a career in developmental trauma. So specifically understanding those pathways within the context of trauma. I did my residency and postdoctoral fellowship at a place called the National Victims Treatment and Research Center in Charleston, South Carolina. And there I started doing some of this developmental trauma research, both longitudinal studies and population health studies, and also gaining some expertise. Is this sounding weird? Is this sounding okay? Okay. Around clinical interventions for kids who've experienced interpersonal trauma. And so for the last 7 years, I've been at the University of Illinois. I run a lab there called the STEP Lab. And also a cool part of my position at Illinois is they actually let me buy out a lot of my teaching with clinical supervision. And so I train kids in some of the trauma-informed care. You know, I might be loud enough. Oh, wow. There you go. All right. It's embarrassing how long that would have taken me to figure out. So well done, Charlie. So, and I direct the CARS clinic, training doctoral students in how we do some trauma-informed assessments. What does evidence-based trauma-informed care mean? And so why am I down here? Well, a lot of my questions, mostly around research, but even clinically, are starting to dead end into identity. Developmental psychopathology is a very mechanistic way of looking at human development. And identity is, I don't think you guys need to know, this is a hard thing to break down sometimes in these mechanistic ways. And so there's lots of questions I have that is fallen into your folks' expertise. So how do we integrate social identity theory into methods and theory for trauma-informed care? The utility of loneliness as an outcome. At the end, interpersonal trauma is a threat against belongingness. So moving away from some of our psychopathology outcomes and looking at more through a loneliness lens or a social connectedness lens. And then how to understand healthy development in the aftermath of trauma exposure. What does it mean for an adolescent to identify as a survivor of trauma as one of the main ways they show growth in the aftermath? Is this something we want to promote? What contextual factors would we want to promote along with it? These are some of the questions I have. And even more broadly, why I'm here at University of Queensland is I'm not here alone. I'm here with my wife and my 3 kids. We were very curious about life in Australia. She actually did a study abroad here a few years ago, many years ago, but she'd like me to say a few years ago, down here in Australia. And growing up as a Joey, I just always had a kinship with this country. So it's excellent to experience it. All right, so what is developmental psychopathology? One way of thinking about it is we take an organizational framework to understanding distress. And so this is the belief that distress results from the imbalance of your own individual development and the expectations of the environment around you for that age. So either delays or accelerations, in the case of things like parentification early in life, create a mismatch between your interpersonal environment and you as an individual. And those mismatches that arrive early in childhood can then potentially lay a foundation for distress and impairment later on in adolescence and into emerging adulthood. And so there's just a few themes I'm going to take us through that kind of we research within a developmental psychopathology framework. So a big one is this concept of continuity and discontinuity. Across developmental periods, what behaviors do we see being consistent and which ones are self-contained within middle childhood or late childhood, things like this. So one way of thinking about this is the quantitative change as one goes with the trajectories of different behavioral or different biological outcomes. There's also heterotypic and homotypic presentations. So not just the quantity of the presentations of the distress and impairment, but how much do they manifest similarly across the lifespan? And we've done a lot of this work around anxiety and depression across the childhood and adolescent transition. So we know that the average onset for a lot of presentations are anxiety or in childhood. For depression, they don't start really until adolescence most of the time. Is this the transition of the same kind of presentation to a more developmentally sensitive way? Are these two different trajectories of behaviors? These are some of the things that we've looked at in our lab. Consistent with the developmental psychopathology framework is this idea of multiple indicators of distress and impairment. And so this distress and impairment manifests across multiple units of analysis. I don't know if you guys use this acronym RDoC ever down here. This is how the National Institute of Health, they kind of shifted from what some of you folks might have heard called the DSM. They shifted from the DSM to the RDoC as kind of their, their Bible for understanding mental health outcomes. And the core facet of that is kind of understanding risk and resiliency from these multiple units of analyses. So we do some of this work. We specifically look at translational indicators of biological risk that we think are really feasible, easy to implement in clinical and community settings. And so this usually involves cardiac indicators of the autonomic nervous system. So we do some stuff looking at cardiac autonomic balance and cardiac autonomic regulation. And what is its potential in the aftermath of a trauma for indicating kind of long-term well-being trajectories, what's sometimes called a peri-trauma response. Another core concept is this idea of equifinality and multifinality. These are fancy words for things that you are all very familiar with in this room. This is the idea that several different pathways could lead to the same outcome. That's the case with equifinality. Multifinality is we could all experience the same interpersonal trauma and respond in very different ways to it. That's the concept of multifinality. Oops. So one outcome I'm particularly interested in addition to emerging interest in loneliness, is anhedonic responses. So the inability to derive pleasure from positive environments or contexts, or the inability to generate motivation for positive stimuli or contexts. We know a lot of the trauma responses we experience aren't really the commission of an emotion. It's not necessarily fear or sadness. Oftentimes it's this emotionally numb response or this anhedonic response. And we're very poor at detecting this, both in research and in clinical settings, right? If you think about your little Likert scales, we ask you all these questions like, are you sad? Are you afraid? Are you all these things? Those are the kids that are marking no to those things because they're not, right? Then they kind of get pooled into this resilient group within our research and stuff like that. And so how do we understand different pathways to it is something we've looked at. And one thing we've found in our research is that experiences of social deprivation, interpersonal neglect, are a little bit more pronounced in those kids who are coming out with emotionally numb responses. And then finally, intertwined with these ideas are just questions around mediation and moderation. So everyone in this room, you do not have to go to Joe Cohen's talk today to know that interpersonal trauma is a bad thing for well-being. But you probably have many questions that come after that. So explicitly saying, why is interpersonal trauma bad for emotional well-being? These would be our mediating questions within the developmental psychopathology framework. And then the moderating questions, contextual questions. Who's most sensitive to certain interpersonal traumas? What are other contextual factors that might dictate trajectory stemming from it? You'll notice a pattern here. I don't have too much time to talk about it, but a lot of our trauma conceptualizations try to differ between the commission of negative events, things like abuse, this bad thing happened to me, and adverse context where there is the absence of supportive care or the absence of some kind of needed resource for daily living. And what we find is that most of the trauma algorithms kind of merge these events together, but the risk factors stemming from these types of experience usually tend to be quite different. So developmental psychopathology has done a lot of good for clinical services. It's really emphasized this developmentally sensitive approach to things. There was a long time in child clinical psychology that we just kind of lazily extended whatever was doing with college students or adults and like tried to put it back just down with children, adolescents, and then like add a cartoon to the manual or things like that. But really what developmental psychopathology has helped show is that the assessments of these outcomes should be different. The risk pathways of these outcomes should be different. And really the mechanisms of risk could be different during these developmental periods of time. Developmental psychopathology is the bedrock for a lot of kind of new types of interventions, things like TMS, things that try to work on these multiple units of analyses. They're the basis for, what is evidence-based mental health services? That's sometimes a murky question to answer, but it's really the basis for individual case conceptualization. What are the things I have to target when working with someone? And mediating and moderating mechanisms serve as the foundation for the development of new manuals. How do we engage youth? What are the most things that are important to target? And developmental psychopathology really has never had a moment like this. It's never received more funding. The shift from DSM to RDoC has really put kind of developmental psychopathologists on the front end of preventive interventions. So you would think mental health is getting better, right? Finally, we're orienting towards developmental psychopathology. Not quite. So we have this very long-standing study in the United States, the National Study of Drug Use and Health. It's been going on for about 40 years. Okay. Perfect. All right. I'll try to stay put. So it's been going on about 40 years. There's close to 1 million people in the studies. And one thing this study is very useful for is understanding how different mental health or behavioral outcomes are changing in the United States. And there's been some research to suggest that depression is slightly ticking up. And it's not a universal phenomenon, that it's specifically ticking up in adolescents and emerging adults. Those are the two kind of lines that are jetting up there around 2013, which is kind of a big boom for social media, which some people have kind of associated this trend with. We think actually the increases in poor mental health are a little bit overstated if they're kind of correctly modeled. But what can't be overstated is that health disparities are remarkably stagnant over the last 40 years. In fact, if I go early on in that data set into the early 80s, the same groups that are reporting the highest levels of depression have gone virtually unchanged up until 2020. And so why might developmental psychopathology not be helpful in identifying some of these trends? Well, one is that we have an increasing disparity between methods used in research and clinical work. So I said multiple units of analysis is an important thing. So increasingly a majority of funding is being poured in to identifying the neural pathways for risk and resiliency. Hard to translate those findings into our most vulnerable community settings. There's a questionable role in measurement-based care for developmental psychopathology or risk factors. Measurement-based care is just a simple way of We understand outcomes in treatment via self-report measures or other measures that take weekly assessments. The way we analyze risk factors, the dimensional models we use, it's not like a clinician can pick up one of those papers and say, got it. This is the index I have to measure, and this is the threshold at it. Then the final thing, and it gets a little bit into why I'm here at the University of Queensland, is that there's a culturally biased perspective in terms of what is risk and resiliency that might make it so that our models aren't speaking to the most vulnerable groups. Some of that bias might come from the population, so not properly kind of assessing risk and resiliency within the kind of most at-risk populations, or not understanding who those individuals are very fully. And it certainly comes from disparities we see in the investigators who are looking at these problems and the communities they're speaking to kind of search out these answers about and things like that, and the methods being predominantly edict methods kind of coming down from those investigators. And so what my lab at Illinois tries to do is bridge a lot of these gaps. So we try to use feasible multi-method approaches. We try to take things that are already in practice and try to understand the developmental consequences of those mechanisms of risk. We try to use multi-informant assessments, parents, teachers, things like this to get at that RDoC initiative of multiple units of analysis from a behavioral perspective. When we do use biological indicators, we try to demonstrate on the front end through research that the settings we're trying to apply them for find these measures acceptable and feasible to use within their framework. In our analyses, a big kind of approach we've taken is to try to work our manuscripts to have these two-pronged analyses, one that gets to the dimensional nuances of a developmental psychopathology framework, but another that uses signal detection theory and Bayesian techniques that really make the findings more accessible to a community or clinical setting. And these decisions prioritize incremental validity, they facilitate clinical decision-making. And a final thing we try to do is really move away from kind of this lazy habit we have in developmental psychopathology of taking one facet of identity, chucking it as a moderator. When you see that non-significant finding, say, oh, it looks like our model generalizes. That's actually a really complex question of what should be considered statistically fair. When do I find a risk index that should be implemented at a population health level? And so we're trying to take a more multifaceted look at kind of what are the consequences and how do we publish research in a more transparent way. So if we do find significant moderation, translational settings can understand what the consequences are of implementing those findings. And then finally, one downside of, well, there might be many downsides of this talk, but one clear downside of this talk is I'm doing kind of a broad overview. I'm going to touch on a couple studies in a little bit more detail on what we're doing right now. But we're trying to change kind of the populations we use in research. So those who are actually most kind of at risk or directly impacted by interpersonal trauma. And we're trying increasingly to use multi-method assessments for those purposes. So the kind of the overarching framework is get community narratives about what they think are some of the risk and resiliency factors that led to their current well-being. And then how do we model those narratives within population health studies to see how they compare to what are called risk factor prevention paradigm theories. Because the dirty secret about developmental psychopathology is we have hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of risk factors. And as an investigator, man, you could just sit there for 30 years focused on your one risk factor, but they all kind of communicate small effects on the outcome. So we could try to kind of find what is this secret constellation of holy grail of risk factors that will give us the most accurate outcomes. Or we could just try to prioritize the risks that those communities already see as most important to their development, which might lead to better engagement. And so this starts kind of the question of what does it mean, this term at risk, which I've used a ton here, and even I've got some queasy feelings about. So what does it mean for a population to be vulnerable? From that RDoC lens, it's really this biological predisposition. We think there's all kinds of risks of translating biological predispositions at risk into applied settings. So we tend to focus on disproportionate exposure to adversities or environmental toxins. And I don't think for this group, this model will be so prominent, but it's a dominant framework, at least within the United States and the UK. So about 25 years ago, Vincent Folletti, who was a physician, conducted an influential study that was really simple methodologically, maybe problematically, but he was the chief medical officer of a health center called Kaiser Permanente, which is one of the bigger health groups in America. So, you know, he could do things others couldn't. And what they did was they gave these surveys that asked questions about these 10 areas of trauma. These are 5 forms of maltreatment for those of you who can't see it. So psychological abuse, physical abuse, sexual abuse, emotional neglect, and physical neglect. And then 5 different family environment contexts that are sometimes crudely called family chaos variables about kind of exposure to impaired caregiver. And what they found was that 4 or more adversities endorsed within a primary care facility, and this study took place in about 200,000 adults. They found that for those adults who marked 4 or more of these adversities, there were a substantial risk for numerous health outcomes, both mental health outcomes and physical health outcomes. And so one translational outcome of this study has been all of our settings need to be trauma informed. You know, there's lots of legislature and a lot of policy around our hospitals, our juvenile justice system, especially our schools being trauma informed. And the one way that's been interpreted is the idea of universal trauma screening to become recommended. The goal of universal trauma screening is quite progressive. If we could identify the youth who are most at risk early on, we could divert the most resources to them. But the implementation of it is quite concerning to me as an investigator, especially one who's worked in the child welfare system for over 20 years. I don't want just anybody asking those questions to vulnerable youth. There's not a lot of forethought about kind of what should our response be as an institution if kids did endorse this and things like that. Do we want the school district knowing some of the worst events that have happened in the kid's life? And then from a more research perspective, I have a lot of concerns as well. We've done some research to show that these adversities don't equally predict outcomes across subpopulations of youth. And so this might lead to different outcomes in terms of accuracy and fairness. And we also know that it varies as a function of age. So kind of how good are these things at forecasting in childhood as opposed to adolescence? Others are aware of these concerns too, and so they've tried to kind of rework what are the adversities we're asking kids. But I have concerns about this. There's still those same ethical issues. We still have issues that in at-risk areas where there already is a shortage of healthcare providers, we're going to have a ton of cases endorsing, experiencing these interpersonal traumas. And what do we do right now with that? And then the inability for staff to adequately support and respond to these clients. And so one possible solution is to answer what would a developmental psychopathology approach be to the trauma-informed screening look like? And there you see our mediating and moderating factors, right? So what kind of gains can we get by looking at, well, that's not helpful for those in the room. What kind of gains can we get for those looking at that latent vulnerability, which is answering that why question? And what questions can we get by incorporating dynamic moderating factors? And can we explain the kind of impact of trauma exposure through these dynamic variables? And so this is the VIP study. It is going to, in total, as of now, be a 7-year longitudinal study. In the first year, we took 3 assessments within that year, and then it's been annual assessments since. Our overarching model is the one I'm presenting in front of you. A simplified one of it, which is just asking, do we measure, if we measure hypervigilance to threat? I know we used to have 1-2 clinicians in the room, possibly. And so these 3 mechanisms are actually the main mechanisms of cognitive behavioral therapy protocols. And what we're looking at is if we measure these main mediating mechanisms of trauma exposure, do we get the same accuracy as assessing those explicit adversities while also developing a more fair and feasible measure? And another thing that moving away from adversities allows us to do is to incorporate more positive constructs, more protective and promotive factors within our model. And so looking at things like social identity and interpersonal relationships, what does this mean if we incorporate this at the screening stage? So I'm going to go through the definitions of these terms rather fast here, just to kind of skip ahead and to leave time for questions. But if we'd like to return to this model for any reason, I'm happy to. So hypervigilance threat is biases in how we respond to neutral stimuli. These can either be avoidant or they could be aggressive in nature. Reward responses we talked about before. These are those anhedonic responses. So how do you approach and experience positive stimuli? And then a wide range of social emotional deficits that tend to look at things like emotional regulation, social competence. Social identity within the original version of this study specifically looked at racial and ethnic identity and belongingness as a dimensional construct. And interpersonal relationships specifically looked at social support for friends and families. So here's a little bit about the methodology. The sample in total is close to 600 youth. It's got pretty good balance with regard to race and ethnicity and gender. And it's in our target age group, which is about 15 years old, which is the transition from early adolescence to mid-adolescence, kind of a critical period for emotional distress and behavioral outcomes to peak. And in the original study, they completed the surveys 3 times in 1 year. And then there's that 2-pronged analytic approach we used again. So it's just a very quick summary of these results. We found really good support for that hypervigilance to threat pathway. We found both avoidant responses. These would be thoughts like, I think the world is out to get me, or I think certain people are in this for themselves and not looking out for me. As addition to aggressive responses, these would be like hostile attributions towards other people. We found that that was able to explain most of the variance that trauma and adversities communicates. We found some support for deficits in anticipatory reward. So you could think about this like apathy, kind of how motivated are you to engage in your positive aspects for current trauma exposure, but found it specific for violent behavior. We did not find any effects for social emotional deficits, which was surprising. And that last one really bugged us. We found nothing for our protective factors moderating the relationship for violent behavior. We found a little bit for current violent behavior, but we didn't find anything for prospective effects. This is a very quick I threw out the signal detection theory. So we use a lot of in the translational analytic approach, we usually use area under the curve as an index of discriminatory accuracy. We have something called diagnostic likelihood ratios to give a bit of a Bayesian perspective. And then we tend to use calibration curves, but we also sometimes use the Spieghalter Z for something called calibration, which I don't know how much calibrated models will be of interest to this group, but it's something that we think it's important for kind of translational work in child clinical services. So some of the conclusions were that HVT could accurately and fairly classify risk across different mental health outcomes. We found actually hypervigilance to threat performed better compared to adversities for PTSD. And now we are continuing the study. We received funding for an additional 5 years. And some of the goals for this is to understand the growth of dynamic risks. So trying to move away from just kind of what is the level of risk, but understanding kind of idiosyncratic changes in risk. And then how do we, we've got the technology to incorporate that really well. And, we know that with set point research and things like that, it might be about the changes in your risk or your changes in your protective and promotive factors rather than your kind of baseline levels of it. And then another big thing is the need to specify social emotional deficits and protective and promotive factors better. And this is part of where social identity comes in. We saw big group disparities when just looking at static demographics and how our algorithms performed. But we think there is great ethical challenges in translating those findings into practice. So really trying to understand better what are those differences we're seeing kind of from the 10,000 foot view, and how could we understand that through an identity lens that might be a little bit more fair to the kind of settings and the individuals. And then also, we know understanding promotive factors, these are resiliency factors, going to be important, not just for the accuracy, but the engagement of our model. So how can we kind of identify ones that have a more kind of clinically meaningful effect into our model? One last problem with the VIP study is that all the theory, all the models came from the scientific literature, from this latent vulnerability developmental trauma model. And for the few clinicians in the room, you know, when you got a 14-year-old sitting across from you, I don't know how much words like hypervigilance to threat, socio-emotional deficits, and reward responsiveness really get the kid going, man, I'm ready to work with you. So what we really were interested in was starting to understand what are some of the community narratives with the communities we work with about how they are already understanding risk and resiliency factor. So the National Institutes of Health, this is the study I kind of gave away at the beginning. The National Institutes of Health gave us some money for a study to examine youth who've had contact with law enforcement and what are these families' understanding of risk and resiliency for their current behavioral problems, but also emotional difficulties that the juvenile justice system might not be accounting for. We also asked a lot of questions about acceptability, right? A lot of the juvenile justice system has translated this ACEs study to these families when they first present in court, them filling out screens about what forms of abuse have they experienced, what forms of community violence have they experienced. These are families who already have a great deal of mistrust, understandably so, for law enforcement. And these are the questions we're asking on the front end. So who would they like to be asking socio-emotional questions by, which questions they find acceptable, and what contents of those questions do they find reasonable and helpful for them for preventive interventions. And then we are comparing and contrasting. We have kind of, as a group, we're part of a collection of population health data sets. And through latent variable modeling, we're kind of recoding a lot of their responses into questions where we can and comparing it to risk factor prevention paradigm models. And what we expect to see is that the community narratives won't necessarily perform better than the scientific models, but we think that they will perform similarly. And if they perform similarly, well, not the sexiest thing from a science perspective, we think there's tons of translational advantages from kind of prioritizing the community narratives in our translational work. Okay, so just a few future directions that are things that are always rattling around in my head that I'm excited to potentially connect with some of you folks here in Australia around is from a developmental psychopathology perspective, better define resiliency profiles stemming from trauma. Really in these cases of deprivation, we're really very much in this inoculation way of understanding resiliency, that this terrible thing happened to you. And as a result of this terrible thing happening to you, you changed in some way, or you defended the attack of it in some way to remain the same. Well, what about the cases of interpersonal neglect? Or what about cases in which nothing specifically is happening to you? How do we understand resiliency and growth within those frameworks? From an applied developmental psychopathology framework, like I said, I'm very interested in multifaceted analytic approaches for understanding statistical fairness from the different algorithms we seem to be generating daily for different behavioral health outcomes. And then how do we feasibly and fairly incorporate a social identity lens into those algorithms? And then finally, for trauma-informed care, I'm a big fan of these things called SBIRT models, which is just a stepped care model. Who should be engaging with people first? At what level should they be engaging in them? And what can we do when kids are just kind of sitting on wait lists or in community mental health, community settings where there's not mental health services? And then finally, this idea of moving away from psychopathology as an outcome. Again, kind of taking this community perspective and whether something like loneliness might get better buy-in from families and things like this for when we're trying to engage them with kids. All right. Well, this does not happen alone. My graduate students, who I'm always indebted to, but especially while I'm halfway across the world and they're still kind of running the ship back in Illinois. So I have three amazing ones right now, Hina, Morgan, and Jaewon. And then thanks to my funders for this work. So that is it. Thank you.